I watched the policeman put Zach and the other three boys in his car. Driving away, he turned on his siren and red light, which seemed unnecessary, but I guess he didn't want to disappoint the audience on the sidewalk. I sat in the truck like I'd frozen, and the world had frozen around me. The crowd faded away, and all the cars downtown went home one by one. People closed up their stores. I stared through the windshield as if I were watching the test pattern that came on television at night. After the shock wore off, I tried to think what to do, how to get home. Zach had taken the keys, or I might have tried driving myself, even though I didn't know gears from brakes. There wasn't a store open now to ask to use the phone, and when I spotted a payphone down the street, I realized I didn't have a dime. I got out of the truck and walked. When I got to the pink house a half hour later, I saw August, June, Rosaline, Neil, and Clayton Forrest gathered in the long shadows near the hydrangeas. The murmur of their voices floated up into the dying light. I heard Zach's name. I heard Mr. Forrest say the word jail. I guessed that Zach had called him with his one phone call, and here he was breaking the news. Neil stood next to June, which told me they hadn't really meant all that "don't you come back and you selfish bitch" that they had hurled at each other. I walked toward them unnoticed. Someone down the road was burning gas clippings. The whole sky smelled sour green, and stray pieces of ash flicked over my head. Coming up behind them, I said, "August?" She pulled me to her. "Thank goodness, here you are. I was about to come looking for you." I told them what had happened as we walked back to the house. August's arm was around my waist like she was afraid I'd keel over again in a blind faint. But really, I had never been more present. The blue in the shadows, the shape of them against the house, how they looked like certain unkind animals, a crocodile, a grizzly bear, the smell of Alka-Seltzer circulating over Clayton Forrest's head, the white part in his hair, the weight of our carrying strapped around our ankles. We could hardly walk for it. We sat in the ladder back chairs around the kitchen table, except for Rosaline, who poured glasses of tea and set a plate of pimento cheese sandwiches on the table, as if anybody could eat. Rosaline's hair was done up in perfect cornrow plaits, which I guess May had done for her after supper. "Now, what about bail?" August said. Clayton cleared his throat. "Judge Monroe is out of town on vacation, so nobody is getting out before next Wednesday, it looks like." Neil stood up and walked over to the window. His hair was cut in a neat square at the back. I tried to concentrate on it to keep from breaking down. Next Wednesday was 5 days from now. 5 days. "Well, is he all right?" asked June. "He wasn't hurt, was he?" "They only let me see him for a minute," said Clayton, "but he seemed all right." Outside, the night sky was moving over us. I was aware of it, aware of the way Clayton had said he seemed all right, as if we all understood he wasn't, but would pretend otherwise. August closed her eyes, used her fingers to smooth out the skin on her forehead. I saw a shiny film across her eyes, the beginning of tears. Looking at her eyes, I could see a fire inside them. It was a hearth fire you could depend on. You could draw up to and get warm by if you were cold, or cook something on that would feed the emptiness inside of you. I felt like we were all adrift in the world, and all we had was the wet fire in August's eyes. But it was enough. Rosaline looked at me, and I could read her thoughts. Just because you broke me out of jail, don't get any bright ideas about Zach. I understood how people became career criminals. The first crime was the hardest. After that, you're thinking, what's one more? A few more years in the slammer? Big deal. "What are you going to do about this?" said Rosaline, standing beside Clayton, looking down at him. Her breasts on in her stomach and her fists were planted in her hips. She looked like she wanted all of us to fill our lips with snuff and go directly to the Tiburon jail and spit on people's shoes. It was plain Rosaline had fire in her too. Not hearth fire like August, but fire that burns the house down, if necessary, to clean up the mess inside it. Rosaline reminded me of the statue of Our Lady of Chains in the parlor, and I thought, if August is the red heart on Mary's chest, Rosaline is the fist. "I'll do my best to get him out," said Clayton, "but I'm afraid he's got to stay in there a little while." I reached into my pocket and felt the Black Mary picture, remembering the things I planned to say to August about my mother. But how could I do that now, with this terrible thing happening to Zach? Everything I wanted to say would have to wait, and I'd go back to the same suspended animation I'd been in before. "I don't see why May needs to know about this," June said. "It will do her in. You know how she loves that boy." Every one of us turned to look at August. "You're right," she said. "It would be too much for May." Where is she? I asked. In her bed, asleep, Rosaline said. She was worn out. I remembered I had seen her in the afternoon out by the wall, pulling a load of stones in the wagon, building onto her wall, as if she sensed a new addition was called for. The jail in Tiburon did not have curtains like the one in Sylvan. It was concrete block gray with metal windows and poor lighting. I told myself it was an act of stupidity to go inside. I was a fugitive from justice, and here I was breezing into a jail where there were probably policemen trained to recognize me. But August had asked if I wanted to come with her to visit Zach. How was I going to say anything but yes to that? The policeman inside had a crew cut and was very tall, taller than Neil, and Neil was Wilt Chamberlain size. He didn't seem especially glad to see us. Are you his mother? He asked August. I looked at his name tag, Eddie Hazelworst. I'm his godmother, August said, standing very erect, like she was having her height measured. And this is a friend of the family. His eyes passed over me. The only thing he seemed suspicious about was how a girl as white as me could be a friend of the family. He picked up a brown clipboard from the desk and popped the fastener up and down while he tried to decide what to do with us. All right, you can have 5 minutes, he said. He opened a door into the corridor that led into a single row of 4 jail cells, each of them holding a black boy. The smell of sweating bodies and sour urinals almost overpowered me. I wanted to bring my fingers up to pinch my nose, but I knew that would be the worst insult. They couldn't help that they smelled. They sat on bench-like cots hooked along the wall, staring at us as we passed. One boy was throwing a button against the wall, playing some kind of game. He stopped when we came by. Mr. Hazelworth led us to the last cell. Zach Taylor, you got visitors, he said, then glanced at his watch. When Zach stepped toward us, I wondered if he'd been handcuffed, fingerprinted, photographed, pushed around. I wanted so much to reach through the bars and touch him, to press my fingers against his skin, because it seemed only by touch that I could be sure all of this was actually happening. When it was apparent Mr. Hazelworth wasn't leaving, August began to speak. She spoke about one of the hives she kept over on the Haney farm, how it had up and swarmed. You know the one, she said, the one that had trouble with mites. She went into minute detail about the way she'd searched high and low, into the dusk hours, combing the woods out past the watermelon fields, finally finding the bees in a magnolia sapling and the whole swarm hanging there like a black balloon caught in the branches. I used the funnel to drop them in a swarm box, she said, then I hived them again. I think she was trying to put it in Zach's mind that she would never rest till he was back home with us. Zach listened with his eyes watery brown. He seemed relieved to keep the conversation on the level of bee swarms. I'd worked on lines I wanted to say to him too, but in the moment I couldn't remember them. I stood by while August asked him questions. How was he doing? What did he need? I watched him, filled with tenderness and ache, wondering what it was that connected us. Was it the wounded places down inside people that sought each other out, that bred a kind of love between them? When Mr. Hazelworth said, "Time's up, let's go," Zach cast his eyes in my direction. A vein stuck out right above his temple. I watched it quiver, the blood pulsing through it. I wanted to say something helpful to him, like we were more alike than he knew, but it seemed ridiculous to say that. I wanted to reach through the bars and touch the vein with the blood rushing through it, but I didn't do that either. Are you writing in your notebook? He asked, his face and voice suddenly oddly desperate. I looked at him and nodded. In the next cell, the boy, Jackson, made a noise, a kind of cat call, that caused the moment to seem silly and cheap. Zach shot him an angry look. Come on, you've had your 5 minutes, the policeman said. August placed her hand on my back, nudging me to leave. Zach seemed as if he wanted to ask me something. He opened his mouth and closed it. I'll write this all down for you, I said. I'll put it in a story. I don't know if that's what he wanted to ask me, but it's something everybody wants. For someone to see the hurt done to them and set it down like it matters. We went around not bothering to smile, even in front of May. When she was in the room, we didn't talk about Zach, but we didn't act like the world was fine and rosy either. June resorted to her cello, the way she always did when sorrow came along. And walking to the honey house one morning, August stopped and stared at the tire ruts in the driveway left by Zach's car. The way she stood there, I thought she might start to cry. Everything I did felt heavy and difficult. Drying the dishes, kneeling for evening prayers, even pulling down the sheets to get into bed. On the second day of the month of August, after the supper dishes were washed up, and the Hail Marys had been done, August said, "No more moping tonight, we're going to watch Ed Sullivan." And that's what we were doing when the phone rang. To this day, August and June wonder how our lives would have been different if one of them had answered the phone instead of May. I remember that August made a move to answer it, but May was closest to the door. "I'll get it," she said. No one thought a thing about it. We fixed our eyes on the television on Mr. Sullivan, who introduced a circus act involving monkeys that rode tiny scooters across a high wire. When May stepped back into the room a few minutes later, her eyes zigzagged from face to face. "That was Zach's mother," she said. "Why didn't you tell me about him getting put in jail?" She seemed so normal standing there. For a moment, none of us moved. We watched her like we were waiting for the roof to cave in, but May just stood there, calm as she could be. I started thinking maybe some sort of miracle had taken place and she'd somehow gotten cured. "You all right?" said August, easing to her feet. May didn't answer. "May?" June said. Haven smiled over at Rosalind and nodded as if to say, "Can you believe how well she's taking this?" August, though, turned off the television and studied May, frowning. May's head was angled to the side and her eyes were fixed on a cross-stitched picture of a birdhouse that hung on the wall. It struck me all of a sudden that her eyes weren't actually seeing the picture, they were glazed over completely. August went over to May. "Answer me. Are you all right?" In the silence, I heard May's breathing grow loud and a little ragged. She took several steps backward until she came to the wall. Then she slid down onto the floor without making a sound. I'm not sure when it sank in that May had gone off to some unreachable place inside her. Even August and June didn't realize it right away. They called her name like she'd only lost her hearing. Rosalind bent over May and spoke in a loud voice, trying to get through to her. "Zach is going to be all right. You don't need to worry any. Mr. Forrest is getting him out of jail on Wednesday." May stared straight ahead like Rosalind wasn't even there. "What's happened to her?" June asked, and I could hear a note of panic in her voice. I've never seen her like this. May was here, but not here. Her hands lay limp in her lap, palms up. No sobbing into her dress skirt. No rocking back and forth, no pulling at her hair braids. She was so quiet, so different. I turned my face to the ceiling. I just couldn't watch. August went to the kitchen and came back with a dish towel filled with ice. She pulled May's head to her so it rested against her shoulders for a minute, and then she lifted her sister's face and pressed the towel to May's forehead and temples and along her neck. She kept on doing this for several minutes, then put the cloth down and tapped May's cheek with her hands. May blinked a time or two and looked at August. She looked at all of us huddled about her, as if she were returning from a long trip. "You feel better?" said August. May nodded. "I'll be okay." Her words came out in an odd monotone. "Well, I'm glad to see you can talk," said June. "Come on, let's get you in the bathtub." August and June pulled May to her feet. "I'm going to the wall," May said. June shook her head. "It's getting dark." "Just for a little while," May said. She moved into the kitchen with all of us following after her. She opened a cabinet drawer, took a flashlight, her tablet, a stub of a pencil, and walked onto the porch. I pictured her writing it down, Zach in jail, and pushing it into the crevice in the wall. I felt somebody should personally thank every rock out there for the human misery it had absorbed. We should kiss them one by one and say, "We are sorry, but something strong and lasting had to do this for May, and you are the chosen ones. God bless your rock hearts." "I'll go with you," said August. May spoke over her shoulder. "No, please, August, just me." August started to protest, but "Just me," said May, turning to face us. "Just me." We watched her go down the porch steps and move into the trees. In life, there are things you can't get over no matter how hard you try, and that sight is one of them. May walking into the trees with a little circle of light bobbing in front of her, then swallowed up by the dark.